Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're focusing on a figure whose life wasn't just lived in public, it was, well, almost performed in public. Princess Margaret. She was, of course, Queen Elizabeth II's younger sister, her only sibling. But history seems to remember her more as the quintessential royal rebel.
Yeah, and her life was this dazzling but also quite heartbreaking paradox. Margaret really, she encapsulated that moment in the mid-20th century where that rigid idea of royal duty just violently clashed with this growing desire for personal freedom.
Right. Self-determination.
Exactly. She was glamorous, sure, but also highly controversial. And the media watched her with this almost obsessive intensity. She became internationally famous, one of the world's most celebrated socialites.
So our mission today really is to unpack that tension. We're digging into the sources to trace her path. From that privileged childhood, which was completely turned upside down by the abdication, through the huge constitutional crisis sparked by her first big romance, then that really tumultuous, almost toxic marriage that followed. And finally, this unexpected, quite profound legacy she left regarding the royals and divorce.
It's quite a journey, and we start with her birth. Margaret Rose, born in 1930 at Glamis Castle in Scotland, which is, a neat little historical footnote in itself.
How so?
Well, she was the first person in the direct line of succession born in Scotland since, the 1600s. But the real foundation of her life, the thing that changed everything, happened when she was just 6 years old. That was when her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated.
And that act, it didn't just make her father, Prince Albert, into King George VI. It completely redefined Margaret herself, didn't it?
Overnight, absolutely. She went from being a relatively minor royal figure to suddenly being second in line to the throne.
Wow.
That huge shift really defined her early status. She was now a child of the sovereign, the Princess Margaret.
So a privileged childhood, yes, but as you said, completely transformed by her father becoming king. Let's talk about her name first, Margaret Rose. The sources actually detail a bit of back and forth on that, right?
Yeah. They do. Apparently, her mother, the Queen Mother, initially wanted Anne Margaret. She thought Anne of York sounded lovely, and Elizabeth and Anne, well, it sounded good together. But the king, George V, her grandfather, he wasn't keen, found Anne maybe a bit too plain, too common. So they compromised on Margaret Rose.
It just shows, doesn't it? Every little detail, even a name, was subject to that kind of external approval.
Absolutely. And speaking of external forces shaping their lives, let's look at their education. She and Elizabeth, they were taught together by Marion Crawford, the Scottish governess, Crawfie.
Right.
But the education itself was, well, incredibly limited. It was structured entirely around their mother's very traditional beliefs.
Which were?
Well, it was a very specific philosophy. The Queen Mother famously believed that governesses, they basically produced nicely behaved young ladies, equipped really only to marry well. Yeah, she even quipped something like, "After all, I and my sisters only had governesses, and we all married well, one of us very well." The whole focus was on deportment, conversation, finding a suitable husband. Not much else.
That attitude, looking back, it's deeply frustrating, isn't it? And Margaret apparently felt that later on.
Oh, definitely. The sources say she expressed real resentment about this very restricted education. She felt it kind of hampered her intellectual development, and she sometimes criticized her mother for, prioritizing those superficial aspects of being a nicely behaved royal over proper academic learning.
So you get this tension building early on. She's being bred for a role she kind of resents, but she also understands its limits perfectly.
Exactly. And that upbringing, it gets interrupted by World War II. When the war started, the two princesses were moved to Windsor Castle for safety. There was pressure, apparently, from politicians, the press, to send them to Canada.
But they stayed. And that led to that very famous quote from the Queen Mother, defining the family's wartime stance.
That's the one. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." Real determination there.
Yeah.
So during the war, Elizabeth, she eventually got to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service. But Margaret was too young for any formal duties.
And that kind of left a vacuum.
It did. And it allowed her personality to really blossom and, frankly, to be indulged. Her father, King George VI, he was particularly taken with her. He famously called Elizabeth his pride and Margaret his joy.
And that indulgence, it became pretty obvious, didn't it? People thought she was quite spoiled.
Significantly spoiled, according to contemporaries. And the sources give us some concrete examples of this favoritism. She got really good at music piano, singing show tunes, channeling that sort of theatrical energy she had.
And the big one,
Yeah.
The sign of her special status.
Being allowed to stay up for dinner with the adults at age 13.
Wow. In that kind of strictly regimented royal household, that was a big deal.
Huge. Crawfie, the governess, she apparently worried about all the attention Margaret drew. But Elizabeth, the heir, she didn't seem to mind. She apparently just said, oh, it's so much easier when Margaret's there. Everybody laughs at what Margaret says.
Huh. So that dynamic was set early on. Margaret, the charismatic entertainer, Elizabeth, the dutiful center.
Exactly. And it defined their relationship for decades.
So Margaret enters the post-war world, already armed with that theatrical flair, that quick wit, and this charisma that could, charm pretty much anyone. That little bit of freedom her parents gave her. It really hints at the explosion of personality that was about to hit London society.
Precisely. Once the war ended in 1945 and the sort of wartime restrictions lifted, Margaret, now in her late teens, early 20s, she didn't hold back. She almost immediately became known as the unconventional royal, celebrated for her energy, her vivacity, and this really glamorous fashion sense. Those striking, vivid blue eyes were always mentioned too.
And she became a real fixture on the post-war social scene, didn't she? This wasn't just, polite mingling. She was actively out there, socializing with high society young aristocrats, even celebrities like Danny Kaye.
Yes, these were the friends who got famously dubbed the Margaret set.
Margaret set, right.
And this set, it was a definite departure from the sort of stuffy, traditional royal circles. They were fashionable, sometimes a bit bohemian. They went to all the talked-about spots in London, the 400 Club, the Café de Paris, the Mirabelle restaurant.
Basically chasing the bright lights of the late 40s and 50s.
Absolutely. And because Princess Margaret was involved, the media followed every single move they made.
That press frenzy seems inevitable, looking back. And Margaret's own actions really helped cement that early reputation. Not just glamorous, but a bit of a rebel. There's that famous story from 1949, the fancy dress ball.
Oh, yes. At the U.S. ambassador's place, Margaret got up on stage and performed the can-can, accompanied by the ambassador's daughter, Sherman Douglas.
The can-can.
Yeah.
That must have caused a stir.
Explosive reaction, dancing the can-can, that notoriously scandalous high-kicking dance. It was seen as highly improper for a senior royal.
So the press went mad.
Completely wild. It really cemented her image as someone pushing against royal decorum. Poor Danny Kaye even had to issue a statement denying he'd taught her the routine. She was basically broadcasting her desire for a more modern, freer life, and society was either scandalized or, frankly, completely charmed.
And it seems charm won out, at least initially. The press called her the world's most eligible bachelor girl, and there was constant speculation about who she might marry.
Oh, intense speculation. The sources mention over 30 potential suitors, titled guys like Lord Blandford, Lord Dalkeith, even, interestingly, the future Canadian Prime Minister, John Turner.
So no shortage of options. But the pressure must have been huge to choose someone.
Really acceptable? Immense pressure. Titled wealthy, stable, that was the ideal. The family apparently hoped for Lord Dalkeith, but he was maybe a bit too outdoorsy for her. Her most regular date in the mid-50s was reportedly Billy Wallace, heir to a massive fortune, £2.8 million back then.
But she didn't settle down quickly.
Yeah.
And as she got into her late 20s, still unmarried, the press coverage started to shift, didn't it?
Dramatically. It went from excitement, who might she choose, to this sort of underlying concern that maybe she'd remain a spinster. And this rising pressure, combined with her father's death and probably a need for some emotional stability, it created the perfect, agonizing backdrop for the romance that would absolutely define her public life. Peter Townsend.
Right, Peter Townsend. This wasn't just a personal love story. It blew up into a full-blown constitutional crisis. It really forced Britain to confront its attitudes towards divorce and the monarchy's place in a world that was changing fast.
Exactly. Peter Townsend. He was a highly decorated RAF officer, a genuine Battle Britain hero. He was also one of her father's equerries.
And
Crucially, he was 15 years older than Margaret. And he was married, with 2 children, when they first met back in 1944.
Margaret herself said her feelings for him really developed during that 1947 state tour of South Africa. Is that right?
That's what she claimed, yes. Their bond deepened privately over the years, especially after King George VI died so suddenly in February 1952. Townsend finalized his own divorce in December 52, and he proposed to Margaret shortly after, probably early 1953.
And that's when the constitutional hammer came down,
Yep.
the Royal Marriages Act of 1772.
That was the big legal barrier. Since Margaret was under 25 at the time, the Queen's consent was absolutely mandatory. But the real problem was Elizabeth II's tricky dual role. She was the sovereign head of state.
But also the supreme governor of the Church of England.
Exactly. And the Church of England at that time was completely uncompromising. It refused to countenance the remarriage of any divorced person whose former spouse was still living. The Archbishop of Canterbury made it very clear he would not approve.
So the Queen was stuck in this impossible position.
Completely caught. Her primary duty was to the Church, to the stability of the crown. Her sister's personal happiness, well, it had to come second to that structure. So she asked Margaret and Townsend to wait just 1 year until after her coronation and her big Commonwealth tour were done.
Trying to buy time, basically.
Yeah.
But that attempt at keeping it quiet? That didn't last long, did it?
Failed almost immediately. The whole romance burst into public knowledge during the 1953 coronation. Reporters saw Margaret standing on the balcony, just casually picking a piece of fluff off Townsend's coat.
Such a tiny, intimate gesture.
Seemingly innocent, yes. But as Townsend himself later said, after that, the storm broke. The People newspaper ran the first story about the scandalous rumors, and the crisis just exploded. The big fear in the establishment, you see, was that this was 1936 all over again.
The abdication crisis.
Right, where a royal choice of spouse had led to an abdication and irrevocably shaken public trust in the monarchy. They couldn't risk that again.
Let's really focus on the weight of the pressure they put on Margaret. If she chose to marry Townsend, the government, the Commonwealth prime ministers, they were all against it unless she formally renounced her rights to the throne. What did that actually mean in practice?
Well, it meant losing her position as a counselor of state. That's a significant role she could act on the monarch's behalf, sign documents if the queen was abroad or ill.
So, a real tangible function.
Definitely. And she'd also lose her financial independence. Her civil list allowance, £6,000 a year, plus this extra £15,000 allowance, Parliament had specifically set aside for her to make a suitable marriage. She'd essentially become a royal outcast, financially cut off.
So the stakes were incredibly high, way beyond just personal happiness.
Yeah.
It was financial, functional, tied to her whole official identity.
Absolutely. And to sort of break things up immediately, Winston Churchill arranged for Townsend to be sent away, a sudden exile, basically. July 1953, he was posted as an air attaché in Brussels.
Just like that. Separated.
Just like that. And for the next 2 years, while they were apart, the whole nation debated it. Opinion polls showed this huge gap between the establishment view and what the public thought.
Yeah, I read that something like 97% of Daily Mirror readers approved of the marriage.
Incredible, isn't it? The public clearly backed her personal choice, her happiness. It shows how fast attitudes towards divorce were actually changing in society.
But the establishment wasn't budging.
Not an inch. The Times ran this really stern editorial, warning that marrying a divorced man would irrevocably disqualify her from her royal duties. And the church was blunt, too, telling her she might not even be able to receive communion if she went ahead.
Wow. But then there's this twist, isn't there? This aha moment from the sources that kind of reframes the whole thing.
There is, and it's truly profound. Documents released much later in 2004 revealed that the constitutional brick wall, well, it wasn't quite as solid as everyone thought at the time. The Queen and the Prime Minister then, Anthony Eden, had actually worked out a secret plan.
A secret plan to let her marry him.
Essentially, yes, to amend the 1772 Act.
Wait, so there was a way they weren't just leaving her to make this impossible choice alone?
Apparently not. Eden, who was actually divorced and remarried himself, so he was sympathetic, he worked with the Queen to find a compromise, something that would avoid the trauma of 1936, but still respect Margaret's feelings. The plan was Margaret could marry Townsend.
Okay, so what were the conditions? What would she have lost under this plan?
Under Eden's plan, she would have been removed from the line of succession. That was the key political safeguard. But, and this is crucial, she would keep her royal title, HRH. She'd keep her civil list allowance, she could stay in the country, and she could even continue doing public duties.
That's completely different from the narrative we usually hear.
It really is. Eden wrote that the Queen didn't want to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. It shows there was immense political effort behind the scenes to find a middle way.
So if the monarchy and the government had actually found a potential path, then the final decision really did rest entirely with Margaret herself. Was it her faith in the end? Or protecting the monarchy's image?
It seems it was the latter, framed by the former. On October 31st, 1955, she released that famous statement. But mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others.
Such a formal, duty-bound statement,
Yeah.
despite what must have been personal devastation.
And the statement itself, apparently they wrote it together. She and Townsend drafted it. Townsend later recalled they both felt this unimaginable relief at being liberated at last from this monstrous problem, but that relief definitely didn't last. The emotional cost was huge, and the sources reveal the bitterness that came later. When Townsend announced in 1959 that he was marrying someone else, a young Belgian woman who apparently looked quite a bit like Margaret, Margaret was reportedly devastated. She wrote to him, basically accusing him of betraying this pact they supposedly had not to marry anyone else. And she demanded he destroy all her love letters, the sacrifice she'd made for the institution. It must have felt incredibly personal and ultimately unreciprocated in that moment.
Yeah, the sources really suggest she was deeply wounded by Townsend getting married again. She had tried to move on herself, hadn't she? She'd accepted a proposal from Billy Wallace in 1956.
She had, but that engagement ended very quickly when Wallace apparently admitted to having an affair while she was away, so more heartbreak piled on.
And then came Antony Armstrong-Jones, the photographer.
Yes, they met in 1958, and the sources suggest Margaret accepted his proposal in October 1959, and this is the key bit, reportedly the day after she heard Townsend was getting married.
Oof, that timing. It suggests it might have been a bit of a rebound, or maybe even a bit of revenge.
It certainly suggests a need for swift action, for stability, whatever the driving emotion was. Their engagement announcement in February 1960 was a huge shock to the public.
Why? Because he was a commoner.
Partly, but mainly because they'd managed to keep the whole romance completely secret from the press, who were watching her like hawks.
That's quite an achievement.
It really was. And the wedding itself in May 1960 was groundbreaking.
The first royal wedding on TV.
Ever. Huge audience, estimated 300 million viewers worldwide. It was a massive PR win for the monarchy, projecting this image of modernization. Her husband was made Earl of Snowdon.
And they became this instant symbol, didn't they? The swinging 60s couple.
Absolutely. Lord Snowdon, being a commoner, an artist, he brought this genuinely bohemian, sort of working class circle of friends into the royal orbit. And initially, the press loved it, saw it as the monarchy finally breaking down those rigid British class barriers, embracing the modern age.
They certainly looked the part, experimenting with 60s fashion, projecting this cool, dynamic image, very different from the Queen's steady traditionalism.
Completely. They had 2 children, David and Sarah, both born by cesarean section, apparently at Margaret's request.
But that glamorous veneer didn't last long, did it? The marriage started to unravel pretty quickly.
Very quickly, it descended into this really intense toxicity and infidelity on both sides. Snowdon was known for having numerous affairs. The sources are quite blunt. If something moved, he likely chased it.
And Margaret.
Margaret also had affairs, including with Anthony Barton, who was actually her daughter's godfather, and a brief liaison with Robin Douglas Home.
But it sounds like it went beyond just affairs. There was real cruelty involved, particularly from Snowdon.
Far beyond infidelity, yes. The sources describe this pattern of really cruel psychological behavior from Snowdon. He apparently used these tactics designed specifically to wound her, leaving nasty little notes.
Notes? What kind of note?
Scathing notes listing things I hate about you, hidden in her books, under her pillow, places where she'd find them unexpectedly.
That's chilling. That detail about the notes, it just shows the darkness beneath that glamorous surface.
Absolutely. One of the worst notes mentioned reportedly read, "You look like a Jewish manicurist and I hate you."
Wow, that level of malice aimed at his wife, the Queen's sister. It's astounding.
It really confirms that maybe the class difference, their fundamental incompatibility, it was just too vast. It led to this mutual resentment and cruelty. By 1973, Margaret was clearly looking for some kind of emotional escape, and she met Roddy Llewellyn.
Roddy Llewellyn, 17 years younger than her.
Yes. She began what she described as a loving friendship with him.
And that relationship is what finally brought the marriage breakdown crashing into the public eye, wasn't it? In 1976.
Violently into the public eye. The tabloids got hold of photos, front-page stuff of Margaret and Llewellyn in swimsuits, holidaying together on her private estate in Moustique-le-Joliot.
And the reaction?
Immediate, ferocious. The separation was officially announced in March 1976, and some Labour MPs actually denounced her in Parliament, called her a royal parasite and a floozy.
Vicious.
The public scrutiny was relentless, and much, much harsher than anything directed at her husband for his own well-known affairs.
So, all this public drama, it leads to the watershed moment. The divorce, finalized in July 1978.
The first divorce of a senior member of the British royal family since 1901, a huge moment.
And Margaret's reaction.
She was reportedly devastated by the whole process, and she never remarried. Though, interestingly, she and Snowdon managed to maintain a surprisingly civil, even friendly relationship right up until her death.
But that difficult journey she went through, it inadvertently cracked open the door for the monarchy, didn't it? The very decision she made back in '55 to uphold tradition, ironically, was undone by her own need for liberation in '78. It's important to remember, though, despite all that private turmoil, Princess Margaret was still a working senior royal. She carried out quite a lot of public service, especially representing the crown overseas.
She did. She started early, launching the ocean liner Edinburgh Castle in Belfast back in 1947, often accompanied her parents on tours.
And her own tours made quite an impact.
Immense impact overseas. That 1955 tour of the Caribbean, for example, created a huge sensation. Local musicians wrote calypsos dedicated to her. It shows that unique international charm she had.
Right.
And as the Commonwealth changed, she was often the one sent to represent the crown at those really crucial independence ceremonies. Jamaica in '62, later Tuvalu and Dominica in '78. She was often tasked with handling those significant, sometimes delicate transitions.
And back home, her focus was mainly on the arts and charities.
Heavily on arts and welfare, yes. She was president of the NSPCC, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and grand president of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, important roles.
And she used her position for things she cared about, like the arts.
Very effectively, especially for ballet and music, which were real passions. The sources detail how she was instrumental in setting up a fund for Dame Margot Fontaine, the great ballerina, when Fontaine faced serious money troubles later in life. That wasn't just passive patronage, it was active support.
You mentioned her intelligence earlier, the writer Gore Vidal, saying she was far too intelligent for her station in life. She must have been acutely aware of her public image, the role she played in the whole royal story.
Oh, absolutely aware. She reportedly even referred to that sort of dichotomy herself, claiming that if her sister, the Queen, had to be the source of honor, the stable center, then she, Margaret, must be the focus of the most creative malice, the evil sister.
Wow. Embracing the narrative.
Almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, wasn't it? Embracing the role the media and perhaps the system itself had kind of created for her.
But that pressure, that lifestyle, it eventually took a really severe physical toll, didn't it?
It did. For most of her adult life, she was a heavy smoker and drinker. Chesterfield cigarettes and famous grouse whiskey were her particular preferences. Many saw it as, a coping mechanism for the stresses and constraints of her life.
And that caught up with her in 1985.
Yes. In 1985, she had part of her left lung removed, an operation that sadly, eerily, mirrored the lung operation her own father had undergone 34 years earlier, the illness that ultimately led to his early death.
Did she quit smoking then?
Officially, yes. Though some sources, like servants, claim they still occasionally smelled cigarette smoke in her apartment afterwards. Make of that what you will.
And the decline continued later on.
It did, sadly. In the late 1990s, she suffered a series of strokes. 3 between 1998 and 2001.
And the effects were quite severe.
Yes. They left her with partial vision and paralysis on her left side. Towards the end, she often needed a wheelchair. It was a very visible sign of her failing health.
She died in 2002.
In her sleep, yes. February 9th, 2002, at the age of 71. And her cremated at Slough Crematorium, of all places.
Why cremation? That's very unusual for senior royals.
Her lady-in-waiting explained it. Apparently, Margaret found the traditional royal burial ground at Frogmore very gloomy. So in the end, her ashes were interred alongside her parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor. A final act of rebellion, perhaps, followed by a return to the man who always called her his joy.
It's easy, isn't it, to get caught up in the drama and the tragedy. But Margaret left a really significant mark in other areas, too, like style.
Oh, definitely. She was a recognized fashion icon, known for the Margaret look. And it was quite purposefully constructed, to contrast with her sister's much more stable, traditional appearance.
How so? What defined the Margaret look?
Well, she embraced trends. Mod accessories, those dramatic sunglasses she favored, magnificent hats. She was a real trend follower in a way the Queen simply couldn't be.
And she had a connection with designers.
A very close, lifelong relationship with Christian Dior, particularly. That famous cream gown he designed for her 21st birthday in 1950, it's still cited as one of the truly iconic royal fashion moments.
Yeah, I can picture it.
British Vogue noted her style really hit her stride in the mid-60s, put her right up there alongside icons like the Beatles. She embodied this kind of royal glamour that felt maybe a bit more accessible, relatable, yet still completely aspirational.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to finance. What do we know about her wealth?
Well, during her lifetime, her fortune was estimated at around 20 million pounds, mostly inherited from her father and various valuable items passed down from her grandmother, Queen Mary.
And after her death?
Her estate was valued at 7.6 million. But after inheritance tax was paid, that came down to about 4.5 million.
And paying that tax bill, plus providing for her grandchildren, led to that quite controversial decision to auction off a lot of her personal belongings, didn't it? Through Christie's in 2006.
Very controversial, yes, because many people felt these were significant historical royal items, things that really should have stayed within the main royal collection.
But the auction went ahead, and the results were pretty astonishing.
Staggering results. They speak volumes about the value the public, or at least collectors, placed on objects that had been touched by her life, her story. The whole sale totaled over 13.6 million. That was nearly double the pre-sale estimate.
Wow. So the provenance, the Margaret connection, was key.
Absolutely key. Items consistently smashed records. There was a Fabergé clock, for instance. It sold for 1.24 million, a world record price for a Fabergé clock at auction at that time.
Incredible. And the most famous item?
Probably the Poltimore tiara, the one she wore at her wedding. That sold for 926,400 pounds.
To a private bidder, right?
Yes. And that tiara being sold off like that, it almost became a symbol of the cost of her turbulent life, the financial need driving the sale, sort of underlined this idea that even in death, her life involved this very visible public expense.
But beyond the fashion and the finance, the deepest legacy, surely, is the impact she had on the monarchy and divorce. That freedom she inadvertently secured.
Without a doubt. Despite her very conscious choice for duty back in 1955, the Independent newspaper later called that whole Townsend affair a watershed in the nation's attitude towards divorce.
Because her own later struggles changed everything.
Exactly. Her painful public struggle and eventual divorce in 1978, that provided the absolutely critical precedent. When her nephews and niece, Prince Charles, Prince Andrew, Princess Anne, when their marriages broke down in the 1990s,
Right.
the public outcry, while still there, was dramatically less intense compared to the fury that was directed at Margaret back in the 50s and again in the 70s. It's like she walked that incredibly difficult, painful path first so they could follow on a slightly smoother one.
So when we try to pull it all together, Princess Margaret's life, we're left with this really stark, maybe even beautiful paradox, aren't we?
Completely. She was the royal who, back in 1955, chose faith and duty, stated publicly that Christian marriage was indissoluble.
Only to become, just 2 decades later, the absolute symbol of the royal divorce watershed.
She was trapped, really, by the very rigid, duty-bound system she had chosen to protect back then. Her cousin, Lord Lichfield, described her life towards the end as feeling unfulfilled. She seemed to spend her whole life searching for a stability, a happiness, that the crown or the constraints of her role often seemed to deny her.
And her private, often controversial actions, the affairs, that tumultuous marriage, the divorce itself, they created the very public precedent that her earlier adherence to tradition had tried so hard to prevent.
Exactly. The rebel royal, just by following her own difficult path, actually ended up forcing the monarchy to modernize, didn't she? To adapt, however slowly, to a changing society.
If her father, King George VI, saw Elizabeth as his pride and Margaret as his joy, what does it ultimately mean that Margaret's own pursuit of joy, of personal freedom, came at such an immense public cost to the very system she was born to uphold? Her life was just defined by that struggle.
It really was.
It leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you, the listener, to consider. If Margaret had chosen love over duty back in 1955 and married Townsend, she likely would have been exiled, possibly forgotten, and maybe the constitutional paths for divorced royals would have remained firmly shut.
A different timeline entirely.
So by choosing duty then, but later being unable or unwilling to maintain that duty in her own life, did her own great personal sacrifice inadvertently secure greater emotional, maybe even marital liberty for all the royals who came after her? Perhaps that life described as unfulfilled was actually the greatest, most complicated gift she gave to the monarchy's future.